Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, thank you for joining. My name is Darren Naftzger. I'm the executive advisory practice lead here at EVOTEK. This morning, we're going to be talking about compliance regulation and the intersection with cyber programs and how important that is, and some of the things that you need to consider as you work through solving for the compliance obligations that you may have in your organization. So we've got a panel of experts with us this morning. I'm going to allow each of them to introduce themselves. Paul, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Paul Keener. I'm the head of cybersecurity operations at City National Bank. That includes our cybersecurity operations center, digital forensics, red team, threat intelligence team.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. And Robert Yaus.
Good morning. Robert Yaus. I'm a CISO and executive advisor at EVOTEK. I'm a multi-time CISO. Been working in media and entertainment as well as insurance, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, and last but not least, Sam.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're at. I'm Sam Masiello, Enterprise CISO for the Anschutz Corporation. We are a private equity holding company for brands in a number of different spaces, including media and entertainment, hospitality, oil and gas, online, film, print media, and many nonprofits as well. So in my role, I have oversight and governance over all of the security programs that are within the portfolio.
Okay, hey, thank you, Sam. And Sam, I'm gonna start with you. So, in security programs that you've led, how have you approached cybersecurity compliance? And with regard to regulations and frameworks, standards, contractual obligations, how did those things get prioritized into your strategy?
Yeah, so I like Robert, I've been a multi-time CISO as well, and as I mentioned, many different types of companies in the Anschutz portfolio, and so we deal with this at a lot of different levels. And I'll say in my past as well, this has really varied from company to company, and based on the industry that they're in. For example, I worked for an online retail company for quite some time, and they were very focused on security and compliance because it was extremely core to how they ran their business from a day-to-day perspective. If the website wasn't available to conduct commerce, for example, that was a problem. If we weren't compliant with the regulations we had to be compliant with, and we potentially couldn't take credit cards, for example, if we weren't compliant with PCI, that was a pretty significant problem. But then I've also been on the other side of that coin, where in manufacturing, for example, security and compliance really wasn't a huge part of what they did, but was an important part of what they did. And so the level of investment, the level of scrutiny, the level of visibility, I would say to some degree, of security within the organization was different. And also the level of investment as a result was different. And so while both sides, I would say, focused on availability as a key point for them, it meant very different things to those companies depending on what they are. So to that extent, the particular organizations that you work at, they may think about and use compliance frameworks differently and think about security differently within their own context. So a phrase that I like to use with folks is the company trying to achieve security through compliance or compliance through security? And to me, while they sound very similar, nuanced, they're very different. And a lot of it goes with who's driving the car, right? So if you're trying to achieve security through compliance, that means to me that you are basically using compliance as your baseline for how you're trying to build your security program, and is kind of the goal you're trying to meet. And in some cases, some organizations, that may be the goal, just given the industry that they're in and what they consider to be their acceptable level of risk, understanding that while compliance being, for most of us, a pretty low bar, right, as it relates to the overall maturity of a cybersecurity program, again, that may be what they're trying to achieve. Or compliance to security, where security is really driving the car and compliance is something that you get as a byproduct of building the other things you're trying to build in security. One of the things you also asked about, Darren, was contractual obligations and how that helps drive sometimes a requirement. Sometimes that can play a huge role in helping defining what the risk threshold for the company is, right? So from a company perspective, you may think that your risk threshold is one thing. However, when you are in certain spaces like the federal space, the government space, for example, they may have some very specific contractual requirements that help drive that risk threshold in different ways, because ultimately you need to make sure that you are compliant with the requirements that are laid out by them, whether that be contractual requirements or specific compliance frameworks that they may also require you to be in compliance with as a result of doing business with them.
Thank you, Sam. That is really insightful, especially around the contract obligations. I'm going to put you on the spot, though. So the most complex cybersecurity and compliance challenge that you faced, what was it, and how did you ultimately address it?
Yeah. So the most complex one, at a previous company, we were being driven to be compliant with FedRAMP. It was not FedRAMP at the time. It was FISMA moderate at the time. Sorry, it was not FedRAMP at the time. So there were a number of things that we had to do that were very fundamentally different to how we typically conducted business at that company in order to be able to be compliant with the regulations that we were being put under to be FISMA moderate. But because of some of the federal government agencies that we were doing business with, we couldn't just bundle their business in the same way that we kind of put everybody else together. They had to have their own physical separate spaces. They had to have their own physical separate card readers. Like, they had to have a whole bunch of different things that were specific to just doing business with them, that, while somewhat tangentially aligned with how we did business, really fundamentally were different in how we had to restrict access to their data, how we had to restrict access to the people that were working specifically on their account. And there was a significant cost there. And from a company perspective, that was not an insignificant amount of money that they had to invest into doing that. But if they wanted to continue to do business in that space, that was a requirement to being compliant with those regulations and that's in those contracts. Otherwise, the fines were potentially up to triple what they had paid us. And so, from a business perspective, when you think about risk, if the risk is triple what you have been paid from that particular contract, that's a pretty good incentive towards making sure that you are compliant with the things that they're asking you to do.
Yeah, I would agree. Those are great incentives. So, Paul, with your experience in the cyber operations space, how I think often compliance and regulatory requirements flow down into the operations tower. How have you, in the work that you've done, how do you take those in? How do you address them, and then ultimately report back out that, hey, we've solved these issues within my arena and can report back positively? How have you addressed that?
That's a good question. Moving into the banking industry was a wake up call, because they operate kind of in the three lines of defense model. So the first line of defense, which is where the operational teams are at, the revenue generation piece, and then you have the second line, which is the risk. Falls on the chief risk officer, and they do the review and challenge. And then you have the third line of defense, which is the internal audit piece. It's supposed to be kind of an independent internal audit. And then in addition to all of that, you still have the regulator coming in and doing the examinations, either using FFIEC, as a framework to use it. The thing that Sam talked about security through compliance or compliance through security. I haven't heard it put that way before, but my general path is, you build the program and you open up the door to anybody that wants to audit it. That's how you should be able to do it. And so we have a number of different organizations who are constantly reviewing and validating what we're doing and providing critical feedback. So we've successfully passed banking examinations, the regulator examinations, and internal audits and all this stuff. So I think our program is really solid, and we're just run it as a sense of, hey, we're not, where there are critiques based on new regulations or gaps that we identify. It's really easy to identify where the risk has been reduced or the compliance frameworks have been addressed, because there's so many different people that you're having to report up to, whether it's to the board, to the risk committee of the board, to to the regulator, having to deal with them, and having to deal with a parent company who's Royal Bank of Canada. It's a lot. So everybody's like, it reminds me of Office Space. They're like, hey, did you do your TPS report? You're seven. Did you get that? And so that's what it's like.
So thanks. Thank you, Paul. Hey, Sam, so Paul hit on a pretty good point, a couple of really good points there in having to pull various parts of the organization together. And I can think about that even more broadly. It's your GRC program, it's your general counsel, could be privacy. In programs that you've worked in, how have you brought those organizations together so you have a unified view of what's going to get done and what the ultimate approach is going to be?
Yeah. So to me, with any security or compliance program, that always starts with tone at the top. You have to get buy-in from executive leadership from the highest parts of the organization before you are going to be successful, period. If you don't have that tone at the top, you're kind of a one-man band, maybe a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest, because you're never going to get the support that you need to be able to drive things forward, right? There's always going to be other priorities. There's always going to be other things that every other group needs to work on. Now, that's not to say that security is ever going to be the most important thing that those other groups in the company work on as well. But if you have that tone at the top, if you have that support at the top, then those priorities from a security perspective can help to be driven down throughout the organization. So to me, in order for those conversations with other business leaders in the company to even start in a meaningful way, you have to have tone at the top. That's where it starts. Now, from there, you need to start building strong partnerships within the business. And when I say that, I don't just mean within the technology organization. A lot of times, CISOs end up getting themselves pigeonholed by working only with the technology teams, or thinking that they are, or sometimes the business thinking that their function exists only to serve the needs of IT, which is part of the reason why we hear the term IT security a lot. Personally, I hate that term because to me, that almost provides the context to the business that you exist to service the needs of IT. Where from my standpoint, you need to be reaching out across the business, you need to build strong partnerships within the business. And so that means educating people within the business that they have data that ultimately they are responsible for that is important. For example, marketing. They typically own customer data and customer relationships. The finance team owns finance data. HR team holds employee data. All of those things are very important when you think about privacy regulations. Those things are important when you think about other compliance regulations. And so you need to work across those partners to not only understand what data they have and what they're responsible for, but how they're using it, and then educate them on how they can help protect that information better. Understand how they're sharing that data, who they're sharing it with. But you can only have constructive conversations on those topics when you have tone at the top.
No, yeah, that's absolutely, I agree with that. And so Robert, so we accomplish all these things in our program. We get the tone at the top, we get the buy-in from the organization, the various parts of the organization. In your experience, how do you maintain that momentum, stay abreast of compliance considerations, and make sure that it's working into the organization and the broader program in a very methodical way? So what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, so I think it's, as Sam mentioned, it really takes team effort. So one of a very effective way is to have a dedicated task force that specifically seeks out for new regulation and compliance standards. So a couple of ways to get in front and stay informed would be to maintain close ties with industry groups, subscribe to regulatory updates. And in these regulatory updates, a lot of times when when compliance requirements are introduced, they go through a review period. So you get very early on, you can get involved, you can get a preview of what proposed rules or regulations are being debated. There's a period for public comment. So this is your opportunity to comment and also work together with peers, actively participate in conferences. But ultimately, that information needs to be consumed internally through that task force. Really understand the importance of the regulations, the impact, tie it back to risk assessments, and that's a good way to be very proactive in preparation for new compliance standards and regulations.
And to that end, I know you've worked in some pretty regulated industries, and there's always, and I think that's really come into focus for us as security practitioners, that the user is becoming in often instances and from a cyber context, the weakest link. From a compliance and regulation perspective, in your experience, how are compliance and regulatory considerations that flow all the way down to the users? What's the best way to incorporate that into your program?
Well, a cornerstone of any compliance strategy is going to be awareness and training. So Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report has one of the 8 risk patterns is miscellaneous errors. So these are errors introduced by humans that cause or that lead into incidents and breaches. So it's very real. An awareness campaigns, targeted training modules, those all are would help to build a security or compliance aware culture within the organization. When it comes to training, also consider really interactive training. I've seen organizations, we've all joined organizations. It's not enough to expect an employee to read a policy and to accept it. So, try to double down on interactive training modules, do as many, working sessions as possible, get the user really, really involved. At the end of the day, I think what should be expected is that employees should know exactly what they should be doing and not be doing. So policy is not enough. A lot of the detail is in your standards and in your operating procedures, and those need to be trained.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Sam, I'm going to swing back to you. So, the interesting piece is our businesses, anyone's business doesn't stand still. They're always innovating. They're always looking to push the envelope for better connectivity to their clients, better connectivity to their business partners, being able to, have greater customer or client experience with their end customers. So how have you balanced the need to maintain, and compliance and regulation usually is a little bit behind the curve with regard to innovation, obviously, but how have you balanced the need to innovate and bring new capabilities into your organization while still maintaining your compliance and regulatory stance?
Yeah. So when a company wants to build new functionality, new capability, what are the 2 things they want? They want it the lowest cost, they want it fast. And they view security often as being kind of the antithesis of those 2 things, right? So to me, the best, cheapest, and most effective way to balance security with the need for innovation and agility is to be a partner in that process, right? Because otherwise, and make sure that you are built into that process as well, because what often ends up happening, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir for everybody who's listening to this today, is that often security is more of a checkbox at the end of the process than it is a partner during the process. And that's where a lot of the friction and the headbutting comes in, because they go out and they build this thing cheap and fast, and then security looks at it and they're like, wait a minute, this is a dumpster fire, right? So if we are more of a partner in that process, we can help them to better identify risks up front, whether those be compliance risks, whether those be technical risks, and make sure at least they understand what those risks are during the design, development, and implementation process, so that ultimately it will be up to the business to decide what risks they want to accept, but at least you've had that conversation and you've been part of that process along the way, so they understand what those risks are along the course of the process. They can make educated decisions for themselves along the way. A lot of that, again, comes back to the conversation we're having a moment ago on tone at the top and relationship building. You can't have those conversations if you don't have those relationships already with your non-InfoSec, your non-technology partners, so they can help understand the value that you're bringing to the table to those discussions and why data protection and compliance are important. visibility is higher than ever in how companies are or are not protecting your information with all of the data privacy laws and other things that are coming down the pipe and have already come down the pipe. Data ownership has shifted, right? The companies don't own the data anymore. It's now owned by the consumers, who have more rights than ever for the data that you're collecting. So it's vitally important to make sure that balance between innovation and agility and security and compliance are being drawn and understood. And the most effective way to bring those concepts together is to make sure that those conversations are happening from the outset.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And a lot of that innovation and agility is coming through SaaS provided solutions, third parties. So Robert, I know you've got quite a bit of experience in the third party risk management space, and especially how the intersection with regulatory compliance. What are the best practices that organizations need to consider as they're innovating, how they're bringing in these third parties, how do they manage that?
Yeah, number one is you need to understand, who your third parties are. First of all, you need to understand, kind of secondarily, you need to understand where the data is, how data flows. And then the third part is, what are your legal regulatory requirements attached to that data, and then also your contractual requirements, which again, it's separate from legal regulatory, but these may be very specific requirements based on the organization's other agreements, consumers, other contracts, etc. So it's important to be able to categorize your data and your vendors based on criticality, and then you perform thorough assessments. I think also having your contractual, legal, regulatory requirements, they need to flow down in all of the contracts. Very often I see contracts written up, but contractual requirements don't flow down, legal requirements don't flow down. So it's important from the perspective is that you have binding agreements, and ultimately that you can audit against those terms that you set forth in those contracts.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Robert. So Paul, nature of work's really changed since 2020. I think most companies have some level of remote work. Some companies have all remote work. Given your cyber operations, the strong background that you have, how has just the very nature of how we work in the last few years changed, cyber operations from the standpoint of any type of regulatory and compliance considerations?
Well, I mean, you have to show that you're as safe remotely as you are in the office, right? And so there's a number of ways to do that. Remove split tunneling, force everything to backhaul through the main data centers. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think, primarily we've talked about the education piece, about making sure that we're enabling, our employees to be aware of the risks and giving them the tools necessary to protect their own home architectures. Because the thing we've seen over the last few years with COVID lockdowns, all that kind of stuff, everything has kind of expanded. The world has gotten smaller. The attack surface has gotten much broader. And so, but people generally have not gotten much smarter about, or much more compliant in their home networks. They're still kind of operating as though everything is the way it was. And it just opens the door for a lot of compromise opportunities by threat actors. So giving employees maybe sponsoring employees get, more secure, type of home network, giving them some opportunity to do that, making sure that your data is not, or, disabling print from home, those types of things where you can control where the data's at, or that the data is at least not leaving your computer. There's other tools out there for making sure that who they say they are is actually who's logged in, all those types of things. It gets super big brothery, but there are, depending on where you're outsourcing and where you're moving to, there's a lot of opportunities there. Within the bank, we have to demonstrate to the regulator that we are, that there is no material difference between the on-premise endpoint and the at-home endpoint. And so it makes it a lot more difficult, I think, at times to operate because you have to have those controls in place. But we don't have those compromises where you've got local admin on the box and they're split tunneled, and they're connecting from Starbucks with everybody watching type of thing. So there are some controls in place that help with that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. And so this is the last question. We're going to round robin this question because I want all of your thoughts on this. So looking ahead, we are where we are today, but looking ahead, what advancements do you see within the cybersecurity arena and also regulatory impacts that you reasonably anticipate in the future that are going to change the nature of how we think about compliance and regulation relative to our cyber program? So Sam, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go around the table.
Yeah, I'll try to keep my remarks concise because I know we're running short on time, and I've got a lot to say on this space. But I think the no kidding answer, right, is AI, and all of the different questions and unknowns that still surround AI. For example, the ethical use of AI, the usage of individual tools like some of the ones that are out on the market today, like ChatGPT, developing a strategy really around how companies are going to continue to utilize AI tools going forward. And I mean that from a number of different perspectives. One, from an outside-out approach, the data that's already out in the cloud, like your marketing CRM systems and your customer, your sales CRM systems. What are people using with that data, or what are people doing with that data that's stored in those outside systems that may potentially help leverage AI for productivity purposes? Inside out, how are you potentially going to utilize data that you currently have stored in-house to be able to leverage AI tools to get better value and productivity out of those? And then from an inside-in approach, what data do you have internally that you're going to try to benefit operations internally and build automation internally? So lots of things, and I know there's a session later to talk more about AI, so I'll kind of leave the rest of that to that session because I'm sure they'll have lots more insights there and lots more time to talk about it. But there's lots of things that need to be thought about with respect to the responsible and ethical usage of AI going forward. Second quick thing I'll mention is around the SEC guidelines and discussions around materiality. I know a lot of that today is focused around public-facing companies, or publicly traded companies rather. But a lot of those regulations and a lot of those rules and requirements will get pushed down to privately held companies as well. And so having those discussions around what is material, what is not material, really are pretty core to, quite frankly, how you should be thinking about risk within the business anyway. But a lot of those conversations haven't been happening in the past. So I'm hoping that these SEC guidelines will help drive some more of those conversations going forward.
Oh, thank you, Sam. And that's really insightful on the push down of those regs into private industry. I think you're absolutely right on that. So Paul, dusting off your crystal ball, what do you see going forward with the intersection of cybersecurity and compliance and regulation?
Well, I think that I agree with Sam on the SEC guidelines, right? There's a lot of people that were hoping, hey, we're privately held, so we're not going to be addressed by the SEC guidelines, but that's not true if you use publicly held companies as third parties. So any type, the government has been remarkably capable of finding its way into being able to regulate industries by leveraging, just like an attacker, coming in through the third party, finding the path of least resistance. And I think that that's really going to, I think it'll impact. I don't know how greatly it will impact. But it is going to impact because there's other, depends on the regulatory industry or regulatory framework you're operating under. In the banking industry and the financial services, it's not. I don't know how much that'll really particularly impact because there's, it's NYDFS, it's the OCC, it's the National Credit Union Association. I mean, pick one, and there are so many other regulatory bodies that are looking at you. But you get into areas that are maybe not as regulated. And that's where that impact is going to have the highest, kind of the highest, battle damage. I think is probably the way I'd say it. That's where I see the biggest issue coming. It's not going to be, compliance frameworks. They're just going to, you're seeing a lot of people getting hacked, a lot of organizations getting broken in, or organizations everybody thought were okay, not okay. And I think that that's just going to place increased pressure on the regulators to show that they're doing the job, which will then, cause some downward effects.
That's interesting. Well, Robert, final thoughts.
So it used to be, when back in the day when regulation came out, there was a lot of room for interpretation. You had a year or two to implement. Now when you look at, for example, the SEC rule change, it is very prescriptive. It is the time to implement. The SEC has given 90 days to implement those rules, and also, disclosure requirements. All of the regulations are becoming much more prescriptive and really tight. And I think that is going to be the trend moving forward. And the best way to get ahead of it is to have a forward-looking approach. Organizations need to get in front of it instead of being reactive as it used to be.
That's fantastic. So I'll summarize that. So it's going to be more pervasive. You're going to be held more accountable for your entire ecosystem, not just you yourself. And it's going to be more prescriptive going forward. I think that's a pretty accurate summation of where things are headed. New challenges abound in this space. So I want to thank each of you for taking the time to sit down and chat with me on this. Sam, Paul, Robert, thank you for your insights. It was very valuable. And for those on the call, we've concluded the panel. So thank each of you for joining. And if you do have any follow-on questions, as part of this panel, please shoot them to me, and I'll make sure they get directed to the right individual, either in our organization or the panelists that have shared their insights today. So thank you, everyone.